The time compass. The Persian Empire, Part 1. High up in the mountains in the north of Mesopotamia, there lived shepherds called the Persians. For centuries, they were ruled by the powerful empires that dominated Mesopotamia. First, they lived under the Assyrians, and later they were at the mercy of the powerful Babylonians. But one day, around the year 550 BC, a brave and intelligent Persian man named Cyrus II rode with his cavalry troops into the valley of the Euphrates River and defiantly planted himself in front of the gates of Babylon, which was the most important city of the age. From their great city walls, the Babylonians laughed at this small group of warriors who thought they could defeat them. But the Persians, led by their crafty and brave commander, managed to beat the Babylonians and conquer the city. Cyrus became a great, powerful, and respected king. Because his people had suffered under the harsh rule of Babylon, he vowed not to be as cruel. And so he allowed everyone to follow their religions openly. This great act is how the Jews were allowed to return to Jerusalem and reconstruct the Temple of Solomon. And Cyrus's descendants made the Persian Empire even stronger. This new generation of governors was known as the Achaemenid dynasty, and they governed Persia for nearly 300 years. Thus taught Zoroaster. Many, many years ago, while the Persians were still living in high mountain valleys, an old shepherd saw a solitary man descending a hill one morning. I think I recognize that person. A few years ago, a young man passed by here. His name was Zoroaster. But if this is the same man, he looks a lot different. I have been living in a cave for 10 years. The solitude has helped me to reflect, and now I am full of wisdom, and I need to tell people of all the things I have learned. And so it was that Zoroaster became a great prophet. He taught people to think and see the world in a new way. For him, there were not many gods, but only one, a unique, magnificent, and creative force, and that force is called Ahura Mazda. Zoroaster taught that the sun reigns with its light during the day, blessing the world with its energy. But as sunset arrives, it hides away, thus allowing darkness to control the night. This duality of light for day and darkness for night was created by the supreme god, Ahura Mazda, and extended to all aspects of life. This meant that good and evil were always present in the world, and that you could not have one without the other. Zoroaster taught that all human beings had free will, and that everyone should choose to constantly fight for good against evil, and that everyone would be judged after their deaths. If they had fought for the forces of good, they would go to heaven. If not, then to hell. This idea of a heaven and a hell arose from the idea of duality that Zoroaster taught to the Persians 6 centuries before Jesus would once again spread it amongst his followers. Building the empire. Zoroaster became a prophet, and from his teachings a religion developed called Zoroastrianism, which was adopted by nearly all Persians. The Persian kings believed that for good to prevail, there needed to be no more war.
No more war? That sounds like a great idea. But how are they going to do that?
Well, it might sound strange, but the Persian kings believed the answer was to conquer everyone in the entire world. The Persians thought the only way they could achieve peace was if they governed all the people of the earth. This way, they could spread the force of good. For the first time in history, the idea of shaping a universal empire arose. Once the city of Babylon was conquered, Cyrus advanced toward the Lydians, the Ionian cities, and finally the Macedonians. But Cyrus died in battle, and so his son, Cambyses II, took over command of the troops. He continued his father's work, expanding the empire into Egypt. By the time the Persians had conquered North Africa, their empire was enormous, occupying the capitals of the most ancient civilizations in history. Years later, rulers would add even more territories into this immense empire, stretching the Persian Empire from Egypt to India. And though they conquered by force, the Persian kings were true to their ideals. They tolerated all cultures and religions that were different than their own, incorporating the wisdom and customs of other peoples and allowing an enormous variety of religions and practices throughout the length and breadth of the empire. Instead of destroying their enemies, the Persians would often give the kings of conquered peoples new lands to govern within the Persian Empire. Their aim was to create peace and avoid any desire for revenge. They also freed peoples who had been forced into slavery, like they did with the Phoenicians, who rewarded the gesture by lending their powerful fleet to the Persians. Organization of the Empire. The enormous power of the Persians was backed by an invincible army of soldiers who came from both inside and outside the borders of their empire. From the east, beyond the Sir Daria River, came horseback riders who were trained in innovative bow and arrow techniques. These soldiers were called mercenaries, which means soldiers who fight for whoever pays them. But that wasn't a problem for the Persians, because thanks to all the lands they had conquered, they had an enormous amount of wealth. The Persians gained even more riches by managing their vast empire well, and they used their wealth to build enormous cities of amazing beauty and luxury.
But I thought the Persians were doing all this to bring peace, not to get rich.
Okay, you got me there. Maybe they thought that bringing peace was not a job you did for free. The Persians forced conquered peoples to pay them tributes in gold, silver, or precious stones. To better organize this system, they divided their empire into 20 enormous provinces called satraps. The satraps were governed by local leaders, but there was also a representative of the Persian emperor assigned to each one. These representatives were also called satraps, and their function was to make sure the correct payment of all these riches made it back to the emperor. But these satraps had so much power that it wasn't long before some of them seized control of their territories and ruled like kings, while keeping most of the money for themselves.
These guys were supposed to be helping, but instead they were stealing all the money?
Uh-huh, that's right. And do you know what the emperor did to control these satraps? He created the first secret police. The Persian kings developed a network of spies who would gather information and transmit it directly back to the emperor. This spy network was so good that it came to be known as the eyes and ears of the king. Let's dig a little deeper with our time compass and find out about other empires that tried to rule the world. The Persians were the first in history who wanted to control the entire world and create a universal empire. All the people of the world united under one system of government. The Persians may have been the first, but they weren't the only ones. In the year 334 BC, shortly after the Persians had reached the peak of their empire, a young Greek general named Alexander set out to become the greatest conqueror in history. He turned around and conquered all the cities the Persians had taken, going all the way to India. Then, 400 years later, by the 2nd century AD, the Romans had reached the peak of their power, forming the greatest empire ever known in the ancient world. From the Atlantic Ocean to the Euphrates River, and from England to the Sahara Desert. 500 years after that, in the year 622 AD, the Muslims poured out of Arabia with the task of converting all the people in the world to the Islamic faith. In less than 100 years, they had created an enormous empire that stretched from Spain to India. Coming up in the next episode, the Persian Empire Part 2. Nobody was able to defeat the invincible Persian army, except a few small cities on the coast of the Mediterranean Sea. Emperor Darius, who thought he should rule the world, did not like this very much, and he set out not only to take back the cities, but to conquer all of Greece.